I am the author. Actually, my latest book is The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. I want to thank all of you for being here today, for joining together this afternoon. I'm thrilled to be back, as it were, in San Diego. I really wish I were back in Southern California in person. I do. And while I regret we can't be meeting face to face, I'm grateful to you for making the time to connect. We all care deeply about our country and its future, which is why I'm here today to talk about the fact that the rise of religious nationalism poses a real danger to American constitutional democracy. I'm going to talk a bit today on some of the key organizations that got their start in California, Southern California in particular, and that have had a national impact, starting with one not far from San Diego. And then I'm hoping to hear from all of you. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the Republican National Convention. Did any of you happen to watch it or any of it? You know, religious faith in God have always been fixtures at both major party conventions. But this year's Republican convention was different. It wasn't just the long list of religious right leaders and activists, including 2 members of power evangelist Billy Graham's family, the anti-abortion crusader Abby Johnson, who was also against birth control, and has said that husbands should dictate how their wives vote, essentially, through what they call household voting. It wasn't just speakers like Donald Trump Jr. and Jim Jordan saying that Biden was going to cancel church or some nonsense like that. The most important distinction in this year's Republican National Convention, this is something many commentators have observed, was in the specific tone and frequency of religious rhetoric that the RNC put on display. In most presidential conventions, it's sort of a feature of the background. This year it was like a blaring, bright siren. You know, look, all presidents in America have at times appealed to religious symbolism in order to unite the republic and rally support for its democratic form of government, but not Trump. Trump uses religion not to unite the nation, but to divide it. He wields the Bible as a weapon of division, and he aims it squarely at the Constitution. This is not politics as usual. This is what religious nationalism looks like. The consensus is still, in some quarters, to view the religious right through a culture war frame focused on issues like abortion or same-sex marriage. But this is a political movement. Its leaders don't want just a few policy changes on abortion. In fact, they deploy those issues, specifically the abortion issue, but other issues too, in order to consolidate their power. I was very recently at an anti-abortion conference. Everything's online now, so I went online. Attended online. And one of the speakers said, there is no victory without unity. Think about that, no victory without unity. They get it. Another speaker says, we need to get people to be single issue voters. And they know very well, if you can get a group of people to vote on a single issue, you can control their vote and get them to ignore a lot of other issues that they might not necessarily agree with. Religious nationalism is fundamentally incompatible with modern constitutional democracy. It rejects equality and pluralism, ideas that our Constitution is meant to uphold. Religious nationalism divides the us from the them, the supposedly pure from the supposedly impure, and it focuses the grievances of its base on demonic or dehumanized others. So now let's go back to that pro-life conference I just attended. Something else a speaker said, which I thought was quite revealing. She said, we need to give people an enemy. She's talking about her people, sort of pro-life activists. We need to give people an enemy. She said, creating an enemy out of the oppressor is the best way of gaining power. So, you know, a demonized other is really what they're talking about. I was reading this morning an old interview with former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And she noted, and I'm going to quote here, she said, a fascist is someone who identifies with one group in opposition to a smaller group. It's all about majority rule without minority rights, which is why fascists tend to single out the smaller group as being responsible responsible for all of the grievances or the cause of all of their grievances. I'm sort of probably misquoting her a little bit, but that's essentially what she said. And this relates directly to the religious rights hostile messaging, specifically around humanists and others who value logic and reason. Now, of course, progressive Christians or other progressive religious folks receive their share of contempt too. Movement leaders are always decrying the false theology of progressive people of faith. Some of America's religious minority groups are also easy targets for the religious right, and they're constantly warning against what they call radical feminists or LGBT totalitarians, whatever that means, when they're looking for a group to blame for all of their problems. But when they're looking for that single target, that internal enemy upon whom to focus their rage and hate, it's the humanists and the secularists who are supposedly out there ransacking everything that is good and holy in our society. And by the way, they lump progressive religious folks also often in with this group of secularists and humanists. They really don't care about those distinctions. Anyone who fails to go along with their program and believe as they do or be members of certain approved religious groups are cast in this other sort of bin of deplorables as they see it. Innumerable officials in the Trump administration are fully on board with this program. I mean, let's look at Trump's Attorney General, Bill Barr. He delivered an infamous speech at Notre Dame in which he blamed secularists, as he called it, for, quote, moral chaos and immense suffering, wreckage, and misery. I mean, Barr, like other members of Trump's cabinet, has embraced wholesale the religious liberty rhetoric of today's religious nationalist movement. When Christian nationalists invoke religious freedom, as they call it, they're always talking about the importance of religious freedom. They're really talking about religious privilege, freedom for them and not for others. The freedom they have in mind is the freedom of people of certain conservative and authoritarian varieties of religion to discriminate against those over whom they wish to exert power and control. The sort of insiders, the power of the insiders over the outsiders. You know, I mean, obviously, if your religion reduces to the idea that like people should have equal rights and compassion and care for the least of these, there's really no liberty in this type of religious liberty for you. This form of religious liberty seeks to foment a sense of persecution and paranoia that serves to unite the Christian nationalist base. It always singles out groups that can be blamed for society's ills, scapegoats that can be subject to state-sanctioned discrimination and belittlement. The purpose of this form, this sort of like maligned idea of religious liberty, this rhetoric, is really just to secure a place of privilege. And not just that, but also to justify public funding of certain varieties of religion. More than anything else, it's access to public money. At the Christian nationalist gatherings and strategy meetings that I've attended, the Democratic Party and supporters are often described literally as demonic and associated with the rulers of the darkness, with the devil. Apparently, this offers justification for every conceivable compromise with principles, every ethical breach, every backroom deal. Now, this brings us back to the issue of authoritarianism. People keep asking how the religious right can continue to stand behind a leader like Trump with his long history of doing and saying things that no so-called values voter should want to endorse. Well, Trump's clear disdain for the rules is part of his appeal to this cohort. His transparently immoral character makes him the ideal leader of a religious nationalist state. He represents the lawlessness of the authoritarian. He puts himself above the law and is therefore representative of the authoritarian impulses of his supporters. Authoritarians today around the world target what they call infidels or heretics or secularists, often for contempt and persecution. But this is nothing new. It has happened throughout history. Let's think about America's pro-slavery theologians, people like Dabney and Thornwell, who promoted the idea of our country as an authentically and orthodox Christian nation with hierarchies rooted in the Bible, they too cast abolitionists, people who wanted to end slavery and argued for equality. They cast the sort of pro-slavery theologians, cast them as heretics and, yes, as atheists. The pro-slavery theologian James Henry Thornwell put it this way. I want to quote from my book, because I write quite a lot about this, this sort of a conflict between the pro-slavery theologians who argued for biblical literalism, hierarchies rooted in the Bible, a kind of theocratic model of government. And this is what they wrote about the abolitionists. They wrote, the parties in this conflict, this is James Henry Thornwell of Southern Carolina, he wrote, the parties in this conflict are not merely abolitionists and slaveholders. So he said they are atheists, socialists, communists on the one side, and friends of order and regulated freedom on the other. So he is putting friends of order and regulated freedom on the side of the slaveholder. And let's remember that the pro-slavery theologians who were arguing this kind of stuff, they were the ones who were well-funded. It was Frederick Douglass himself who said that, yes, of course, there are some abolitionist theologians arguing from humble pulpits, meaning they're the ones who just don't have the money. He said, but the $5,000 divines, meaning the very well-funded theologians, $5,000 was a lot of money at that time. He said they're invariably on the side of the slaveholder. They were either promoting slavery or had made their peace with it. A century later, segregationists also called those who opposed institutionalized racism atheistic. So you see the term atheistic has been used to malign people who argue for equality over time. Bob Jones Jr., that you might be familiar with him, he was a sort of infamous right-wing pastor. He delivered a radio address in 1960 titled, "Is Segregation Scriptural?" in which he declared, God is the author of segregation, and Bob Jones Jr. called the practice of segregation God's established order. He referred to desegregationists as satanic propagandists and religious infidels who wanted to overthrow the established order of God. Does this sound familiar? Well, in the 1980s, 1980s, I should say, the influential theologian and radio personality D. James Kennedy, who, by the way, received millions of dollars in donations from the family of Betsy DeVos, who is now the education secretary, as you know, he wrote that public education was atheistic, amoral, evolutionary, socialistic, and anti-American. Public schools, as we know, serve diverse populations, and they fail to affirm or deny any particular religious belief, and anything that sort of fails to affirm a sort of religious nationalist they see as hostile to them, even if it's neutral. They say there's no neutrality. I've been writing about this movement for a decade. My journey in this area started in my daughter's public elementary school in Santa Barbara, not far from you guys, just a ways up on that cute little train. And although we don't live there now, unfortunately, my research keeps bringing me back to Southern California. I focused one chapter of my book on a fellow from Orange County named Jim Doman. Jim Doman's story is a really irresistible one for anyone interested in understanding the movement's structure and aims. He's a pastor who identifies himself as a former homosexual, and he founded a large statewide organization called Church United. The goal of Church United is to politicize pastors in the right direction and to get them involved in politics, and then to get them to encourage their congregations to turn out and vote the so-called correct way, or the biblical way. Church United, and when we're talking about biblical, we're talking again, abortion, anti-same-sex marriage. In fact, Jim Doman is was very involved in campaigning for Prop 8, which sought to ban same-sex marriage in California. So Church United started with 6 affiliated pastors in 2014. The group now counts well over 500 pastor members, all up and down the coast, sort of crisscrossing the state. They host regional briefings, facilitate partnerships with local and state officials, and they take members on what they call awakening tours of the state capital in Sacramento They learn about the legislative process and strategically target committee members, as they call it. They say, we strategically target committee members to defeat the enormous evil facing California from the legislature. So it is essentially, in part, Doman's organization, a voter outreach machine working through pastors. Movement leaders know very well that pastors drive votes. And the aim of this organization, as other organizations, very similar organizations, but operating at a national level, is really to get pastors to persuade their congregations to vote their so-called biblical values. Jim Doman invited me to attend. It was interesting. I'd written a piece about him. He knows I'm an opposition journalist, but he invited me nevertheless to attend a Church United event at a Chula Vista megachurch, which gathered together dozens of mainly Latino pastors and their families. So one speaker told, so we're in this huge auditorium in this beautiful megachurch. There must have been, I don't know, 400 people in attendance or more, 400 to 500. And, you know, when there's a number of speakers, the event was held in the Spanish language. So some of the speakers were Anglo, but had Spanish translators. One speaker told the group, when you're talking with your congregation about economic issues, what's more important? Talking about the minimum wage or about life? When they say life, they mean abortion. So, you know, they know very well if you can get people to vote on a single issue, you can control your vote. A binary life and death issue, you can control their vote, and you can also get them to ignore a lot of other stuff that they might not agree with. Doman's efforts appeared, now they talked about other issues too. I could get into those later if you want, maybe in the Q&A. But you know, you could ask how effective is Doman's organization? Well, it's effective. Bob Branch, one of the pastors who is affiliated with this network and who leads a church called the Community Springs Church in Temecula, said that after attending one of Doman's events, he realized that by refraining from talking about politics, as many pastors do, he was, quote unquote, conceding the public square to the devil. He was speaking about abortion activism, pro-life activism in his church. He said to the congregation, every single person in this room has a sphere. And if we actually become God's change agents within these spheres, we're talking about 150 people impacting perhaps 10,000 people. And that infection spreads. So if Mr. Branch is able to spread this so-called infection, as he called it, it will mint right-wing voters, far-right voters. In a Church United video, Pastor Rob McCoy said, the only commodity or currency in politics is winning elections. We have got to get folks in the congregations to step into this political mountain of influence. McCoy, as many of you may know, is the Thousand Oaks pastor. He's always getting involved in politics in various ways. He was fired a couple of years ago. He fired some preschool teachers. Actually, it was, I think, 2015, for failing to attend church often enough. And this made the news, and he's made the news on other occasions for similar types of things. But you know, we are really not dealing with a cultural movement. We're dealing with a political movement. This is not just about firing people for not going to church often enough who work in church schools. This is not just about abortion. This is not about anti-gay activism. This is a political movement. The movement is a machine with many components, including religious right policy groups, networking groups, media and legislative initiatives, legal advocacy groups that I think are to a largely unappreciated degree leading some of the strategy of the movement, data organizations that are also really underestimated, the power of which are underestimated. What do they want? They want a lot more power for themselves and their networks and for the political leaders they support. And they also look forward to a time when their organizations can rely on the government for a steady stream of tax dollars. Now, I think it's helpful in understanding the movement to focus on its ideology and to focus on the ideology of movement leaders and to look beyond the issue, the sort of low-hanging fruit of the culture war issues. So let's talk about that for a minute. I learned a lot about that ideology when I visited a large agricultural fair in California's San Joaquin Valley. I was there to attend the 20th anniversary celebration of Ralph Drollinger. He's the founder of Capital Ministries. He targets political leaders at the top levels of government. Drollinger's weekly Bible study group in the Capitol has been attended by at least 12 out of 15 current and former members of Trump's cabinet, including Alex Azar, Betsy DeVos, Ben Carson, Mike Pompeo, and others. Drollinger also has Bible study groups targeting the Senate and House of Representatives. In Tulare, when I was there, Agricultural Secretary Sonny Perdue and Michelle Bachmann, remember her? They were among the many politicians delivering speeches or endorsements. So Drollinger is arguably one of the most politically influential pastors in America. And the expansiveness of his positions on domestic, economic, and foreign policy issues hits home the fact that Christian nationalism is a political movement, not merely a stance in the so-called culture wars. He weighs in on a number of social and economic policy questions in study guides. I brought one to show you, like these. It's called Solomon's Advice on How to Eliminate a $20.5 trillion debt, and it really focuses on economic policy and government. So Drollinger is against progressive income taxes. He's against government regulation of businesses, and he is referred to environmentalism as a false religion. And these are things that he says that these types of biblical teachings are really supposed to guide political leaders when they're crafting government policy. And he promotes the idea that social welfare programs have no basis in scripture. He has words of wisdom for the workforce too. In a Bible study titled Toward a Better Biblical Understanding of Lawmaking, he cites from the New Testament, the first letter of Peter 2:18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. Like, just listen to that. Servants, be submissive to your masters, not just to those who are gentle and good, but also to those who are unreasonable. So he cites this, and here he explains the economy of Rome at the time of Peter's writing was one of slave and master. The principle today, however, of submitting to one's boss carries over to today. Now, think about that for a moment. The principle of submitting to one's boss, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. I mean, this is music to the ears of the movement's plutocratic funders, many of whom rely on minimal rights for the workforce and economic and environmental deregulation, climate denial perhaps, to maintain and increase their profits. But while movement leaders oppose what they call government handouts to the poor, they have no problem at all with government handouts and other free goodies to conservative religious groups. The movement has learned to siphon public money through subsidies, tax deductions, grants, vouchers, and other schemes. And they have their eyes trained not just on their existing subsidies, but also on a vast flow of public money in the future. This past winter, 8 federal agencies proposed changes in how they're going to work with religious organizations. This is a Trump administration thing, right? They're substantially increasing the flow of public money to their groups in ways that will allow these religious groups to continue to discriminate and proselytize, all on the taxpayer dime, all in the name of so-called religious liberty. It's really, by the way, you know, the government is now allowing federal pandemic aid to pay clergy salaries. This is something, a direct payment of our tax dollars to fund religion. This would have been unthinkable in previous decades. You know, I don't want to take too much time in the speech, but I want to talk very briefly about the data machine, sort of Christian nationalist voter turnout machine, how it relies on data, by talking about another California organization that I wrote about in The Power Worshippers called United in Purpose. United in Purpose is a data organization that uses psychological profiling to turn out voters for right-wing Republican candidates. It identifies a lot of these voters through conservative church membership lists, membership in organizations opposing marriage equality and abortion and other means. Its founder, Bill Dallas, has not been shy at all in describing the massive reach of his data operation. In a 2016 interview, he said, "We have about 200 million files, so we've pretty much the whole voting population in our database." And he said, "What we do is track to see what's going to make somebody vote either one way or not vote at all." Now that initiative too has its roots here in California, more precisely in San Quentin State Prison. That's where Bill Dallas, who is a former model and then real estate developer, spent several years for various financial crimes before founding the organization United in Purpose and working his way into the heart of the Christian nationalist voter turnout machine. It's a wild story. I do urge you to read my book to get all the crazy details. I don't have time for too many of those details here, but I want to look at just one of the tools that they've offered. It's called Project 75. It's a tool for pastors that helps them get out their congregations to vote. The program features what they call a church voter lookup tool that provides reports on what percentage of the congregation is registered to vote, what percentage actually voted in the last election, and then after each election, they'll give pastors a follow-up report to track progress. You know, there's actually a tool allowing pastors to look up whether an individual member of their congregation voted. I mean, you can imagine the conversations that might spark from that type of initiative. Like, I see Mrs. Jones, you didn't vote in the last election. Don't you know it's your biblical duty? You want to save those babies, don't you? I mean, you know, look, all political operations, of course, rely on data and activist networks to sharpen their effectiveness in election campaigns. Democrats do too. But these right-wing initiatives are largely operating in the religious sphere, almost all of which is exempt from taxes and shielded from public scrutiny. Now, the rise of Christian nationalism should alarm all of us who care about the future of democracy in America. Yet it should not be the cause of despair. We have faced terrible crises and challenges before, and often great periods of progress emerge from them. We're seeing a lot more political engagement today than we saw 5 or 6 years ago. But here's the thing, you simply cannot affect meaningful change without winning elections. There is no substitute for the power of the vote. The right gets that, you know. Those who oppose the politics of conquest and division should appreciate that as well. As they say, there is no victory without unity. We can't allow ourselves, of course, to be comforted by polls. A mistake people make is that they assume that in America, the majority rules, but it doesn't in a country where 40 to 50% of people don't turn out to vote. And an additional number are disenfranchised through race-based gerrymandering, voter suppression, and other forms of trickery. You know, they don't need a majority to win elections. You know, they just have this sort of committed minority, and they turn out the vote in disproportionate numbers in order to access the levers of power. The challenges we face today are political, and so the solutions are political too. You know, there is no victory without unity. The right has invested in all the tools of modern political campaign infrastructure, data, media, and messaging. These tools are available to all of us who oppose the politics of division and conquest. Religious nationalists are using the tools of democratic political culture to dismantle democracy, but those same resources can be used to restore it. Thank you so much.